A long time ago in a faraway land, an old and sick sultan lay dying. He had ruled his empire for many years, and now it was time to pass the throne to one of his sons. The problem was he had way too many of them, and in order to keep control over his massive empire, he needed only one. So what did he do? He locked all but one of his sons in a cage, left them to die of starvation. Only the chosen one would get the throne and all the power that came with it. This isn't a scene from Game of Thrones, although it could easily fit in. It happened for real in the Ottoman Empire. And this wasn't just a one-time thing. This is exactly how most sultans got the throne. For centuries, brothers were locked up in cages and left to die horrible deaths. But why? Let's find out. What happens when you live in a cage? First of all, you get really skinny because you can't get enough food. Then your muscles start to waste away. After that comes insanity and finally death. The last Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed VI, died in this very way. He was locked up by his own father, the Sultan Bayezid I, who had seized power in a coup. He locked up his young brother in a cage along with several other rivals, and they all wasted away. Even though Mehmed was only 27 years old when he died, he weighed only 37 kilos, or about 80 pounds. That's as heavy as a bowl of rice. But this wasn't some special case. It was normal. If we take a look at the history of the Ottoman Empire, we will see that almost every sultan came to power by killing his brothers, or half-brothers. It all started with Orhan, who became sultan after his father. Osman, the founder of the dynasty, died in 1288. Orhan was supposed to be the heir to the throne, so there was no need to lock him up in a cage. But this wasn't the case for his younger brother, Aladdin, who was kept in a cage for 10 years. Until he died, this was done to prevent any possible rebellions. Then came Murad I, who imprisoned his brother, Yaqub, in a cage in 1359. Yaqub was also the son of the previous sultan, but he didn't seem to be a threat to Murad. Maybe he was too young, or maybe Murad just hated him for no reason whatsoever. Either way, Yaqub spent the last 17 years of his life in a cage until he died in 1376. Murad's son, Bayezid I, continued this horrible tradition. As I mentioned before, he locked up his son, Mehmed, along with several other rivals, and they all died horrible deaths. But this wasn't the end. Under Bayezid's rule, even more brothers were locked in cages. Selim, the future Sultan Selim I, was imprisoned by his father and kept in a cage for 8 years, from 1465 to 1473. Then Mustafa, another one of Bayezid's sons, tried to rebel against his father, so he was locked up in a cage and starved to death. Next was Ahmad, who was also imprisoned by his father, Sultan Bayezid. And finally, Korkut, who was kept in a cage by his brother, Sultan Selim, until he died in 1511. And if you think that's the end of the story, you are very wrong. Even more sultans were imprisoned by their brothers. Mustafa III was killed by his brother, Ahmed I. In 1703, then Ahmed's son, Sultan Mustafa II, wasn't killed by his father, but he was locked in a cage anyway. In 1757, the Sultan's wife, Turhan Hatun, imprisoned her husband's brother, Rafi Effendi, in a cage. And finally, Sultan Abdul Hamid II was deposed by his own brother, Mehmed VI, and he spent the last 7 years of his life in a cage until he died in 1926. So why did they do this? Why did they lock up their own brothers, sons, and even nephews? There are a few reasons for this, but the main one is power. You see, the Ottoman sultans didn't want to share power with anyone, not even with their own relatives. They wanted to be the one and only ruler of the empire, and if there was anyone who could threaten their power, they would get rid of them, even if it meant locking them up in a cage and letting them starve to death. Another reason was fear. The Ottomans were afraid of rebellions. You see, the empire was huge, and it was impossible to control all of it at once. So the sultans kept a close eye on their brothers and sons, always suspicious that they were planning a coup. If they saw any sign of disloyalty, they would lock up the offender in a cage. The third reason was tradition. By the time the Ottomans started imprisoning their relatives, it had become a tradition. It was something that everyone expected, and if you didn't follow the tradition, you were seen as a bad sultan. So even if a sultan didn't want to lock up his brother, he felt like he had to. The first Sultan to break the tradition was Mehmed II, but he didn't do it for a good reason. He just didn't have any brothers. Otherwise, he would have locked them up in cages, just like his father did to him. It is important to mention that these weren't the only victims of the cage killings. Sometimes the Ottomans locked up their wives and concubines in cages as well. For example, in 1718, Sultan Ahmet III locked up his wife, Satibal, in a cage. She was only allowed to eat cucumbers and cabbage, and she died within a few months. Another victim was Sultan Abdulhamid II's wife, Sabia Sultan, who was locked up in a cage for 12 years until she died in 1927. It may seem hard to believe, but this actually happened. The Ottoman sultans were known for their cruelty, and they didn't hesitate to use violence against anyone, even their own family members. Locking people in cages and letting them starve to death was just another day in the Ottoman Empire. Now let's move on to some interesting questions that you may have. What was the purpose of the cages? The cages were used to imprison and isolate the Ottoman sultan's rivals, usually their brothers or sons. They were locked up in the cages for extended periods, sometimes years, until they died of starvation. How did the prisoners die? The prisoners died of starvation and dehydration. They were only given enough food and water to survive, not to thrive. And since they were kept in isolation, they had no one to talk to or ask for help. This led to severe mental health issues and eventually death. What was the fate of the Sultan's brothers and sons? The fate of the Sultan's brothers and sons varied depending on their relationship with the Sultan and the perceived threat they posed. Some were locked up in cages and starved to death, while others were put to death in more brutal ways. Still, others were exiled from the empire. What was the legacy of the Ottoman Sultan? The Ottoman sultans left behind a legacy of cruelty and oppression. Their reign saw the deaths of countless innocent people, including their own family members. Despite their brutality, they managed to create a vast empire that lasted for centuries. That's all for today. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos like this.